"You'll be dust by morning, old woman." That's what my son-in-law, Wesley, hissed before he slammed the car door shut. I watched them go, my only child, Charlotte, and the conniving snake she married, speeding away across the remote scrubland of Morocco, leaving me for dead in the merciless, scorching heat. They drove off, believing they'd soon control the entire $450 million estate my late husband, Arthur, had left behind. They had no idea that moment wasn't my end. It was just the final failed test Arthur had built into his will. Before I tell you what happened next, I want you to stay with me. This is not just a tale of betrayal. It's a lesson in strategy that only a lifetime of experience can teach. It warms this old heart to know where my words travel. So please settle in. Let me tell you how I, Eleanor Vance, a 75-year-old widow from the frosty suburbs of Minneapolis, ended up stranded hundreds of miles from civilization, and how my own family's shocking greed became the meticulous architect of their ultimate downfall. Trust me when I tell you, this story has a few surprising twists my own children never saw coming. It started 6 months earlier with the sudden, terrible silence that descends when a heart stops beating. Arthur and I had been married for 51 years. Losing him to a massive, swift heart attack felt like losing the foundations of the house I lived in. He was a brilliant man, not just my companion, but the engine of our life. And he had been, as the attorneys put it, extraordinarily meticulous in preparing for my future. The lawyers, Mr. Sterling and his associates, spoke of generational wealth, a fortune accumulated through decades of shrewd, ethical financial planning, enough to ensure several generations of the Vance line would never worry about money. Arthur and I had only one child, Charlotte. Charlotte had always been a planet orbiting far outside our domestic solar system. After college, she'd chased the ephemeral glitter of Los Angeles, calling only on birthdays and holidays, and almost always with the quiet request for a little help to cover rent, credit card bills, or a car note. The requests, predictable as winter, had started small again soon after Arthur's funeral. But they gained weight and frequency. Then, like a vulture spotting fresh carrion, Charlotte arrived back in Minneapolis with her new husband, Wesley, a month after the burial. She claimed she wanted to reconnect and be there for Mom during this difficult time. I should have known better. Grief is a terrible solvent. It dissolves your skepticism and makes you vulnerable to hope, even the synthetic kind. Wesley was everything Charlotte wasn't. Attentive, full of grand ideas for family healing, and possessing a charm that felt expertly calibrated, like a finely tuned machine. He was also nearly 7 years older than my 27-year-old daughter, a detail that should have been the first, loudest alarm bell. But he had this way of making you feel seen, like you were the wisest, most important person in the room. A classic manipulator, I realize now. But then I was just a tired old lady clutching at any warmth. The warning signs were plastered everywhere in retrospect. Charlotte started asking increasingly specific, casual-sounding questions about Arthur's will, about the liquidity of our assets, and whether I'd made provisions for her future. Wesley, meanwhile, kept gently nudging me toward updating my estate planning, suggesting I needed younger, more modern perspectives on managing such a vast fortune. "Eleanor," Wesley had purred one afternoon, leaning conspiratorially over my kitchen table. "Arthur always talked about seeing the great architecture of the world. The Atlas Mountains, the ancient Kasbahs. Why don't we make that dream come true? A family trip to Morocco, to heal and bond." I was genuinely touched. Arthur and I had dreamed of that trip for 40 years. Now Wesley was offering to fulfill it, while my own daughter sat silently, nodding along. What I didn't know was that they'd already spent weeks in a cold, calculating frenzy. They had researched Moroccan law, the time it takes for a missing person to be declared legally deceased, and the legal hurdles of an American estate frozen overseas. Wesley had convinced Charlotte that I was losing my grip, that I was going to donate their rightful inheritance to a cat sanctuary or a failing public library. He painted me as a reckless, sentimental fool who didn't understand the value of their money. The actual truth was far simpler. Wesley was drowning in debt from a spectacular, failed real estate scheme involving high-stakes investors in Dubai and London. He needed Arthur's money not for luxury, but for survival. Charlotte, desperate to keep the man who had briefly made her feel special, was willing to do anything he asked, even if it meant abandoning her mother to die. We flew into Casablanca a month later. The first few days were like a scene from a glossy travel brochure. We saw the Hassan II Mosque, spent a night in a beautiful riad in Marrakesh, and Tyler played the perfect, adoring son-in-law, insisting on capturing memories of Charlotte and me together. Now I know he needed proof that I was alive, well, and happy at the start of our journey, evidence to confuse investigators later. On our fourth day, Wesley suggested we rent a rugged 4x4 and explore what he called authentic Berber Morocco, far from the tourist throngs. He claimed he'd found an incredible, secluded village near Rassani. Charlotte looked pale and tense, but Wesley's enthusiasm was a relentless, high-pressure tide. I agreed. We drove for hours, the landscape gradually shedding any sign of life, becoming nothing but ochre rock and relentless blue sky. I sat in the back with a small day pack, sunscreen, a bottle of water, a few packaged biscuits. I was actually enjoying the raw, magnificent adventure of it all. Then the car stopped. "Engine trouble," Wesley announced, popping the hood. "Eleanor, would you mind grabbing that heavy wrench from the storage box in the back? I need to tap a valve." I stepped out to help, stretching my 75-year-old knees. That's when I heard the sickening, synchronized thuds of the front doors slamming shut. By the time I turned around, Wesley was already backing the car away. Charlotte was rigid in the passenger seat, staring straight ahead, not meeting my gaze. "Wesley! Charlotte? What in God's name is happening?" "Sorry, Eleanor," Wesley called out. His charm vanished, replaced by a cheap, desperate cruelty. "Nothing personal, but we need Arthur's money now, not when you decide to kick the bucket in 20 years. Charlotte finally turned her head, and the dead emptiness in her eyes gave me my answer. This was no spontaneous act of madness. This was engineered. "Charlotte," I said, my voice rock steady despite the monumental shock. "Whatever that man has promised you, it is not worth this. It's not worth your soul." "You'll be dust by morning, old woman," Wesley hissed, hitting the gas. The car spun around in a plume of dust. And then they were gone, leaving me alone with my small pack, the clothes on my back, and the knowledge that my only child had just sentenced me to death. The silence of the desert was deafening. But something strange happened as I watched their dust cloud dissolve. Instead of panic, a cold, hard clarity descended. If Charlotte and Wesley thought they were dealing with some frail, helpless old widow, they were about to learn precisely how wrong they were. Arthur hadn't married a fool. You don't survive 5 decades with one of the shrewdest financial planners in the Midwest without learning a few things about strategy. They had just committed the biggest tactical error of their pathetic lives. But first, I had to survive the desert. Standing alone in that relentless sun, the heat was a physical enemy. My Minnesota mind, trained by decades of practical winter survival, kicked into gear. Panic was a luxury I simply couldn't afford. I had maybe 12 hours of water, a few crackers, and a hat. The nearest road, not the track we were on, but a genuine road, could be 20 or 200 miles away. Prioritize. I found a meager cluster of rocks that offered a slice of shade and sat down to think. Charlotte and Wesley's plan required my death to be swift and untraceable. They needed time to get back to civilization, report me missing from the hotel, and begin the legal maneuvers to access Arthur's accounts. That, I realized, was the fatal flaw. They knew Arthur was wealthy, but they had no idea how he had structured our money. Arthur had always been paranoid about family members turning greedy after his death, having seen it happen in his own childhood. Every major asset was locked in an intricate series of trusts with specific, ironclad conditions that not even I fully understood. Only the executors and Arthur's lawyer, Mr. Sterling. Wesley and Charlotte were about to discover that stealing from the dead isn't nearly as easy as they imagined. As the sun began its brutal descent, painting the rocky expanse in impossible shades of copper and violet, I rationed my water and started walking. I followed the faint tire tracks, knowing that moving at night, when the temperature would plummet, was my best chance. The desert at night is a place of absolute silence and humbling scale. The stars were so bright they felt close enough to touch, and the cold, after the baking day, cut through my thin clothes. My feet were blistering in my walking sandals, and my mind was singing with fatigue, but I kept moving. Thank goodness my father, a former sailor, had insisted I learn basic celestial navigation as a child. I kept the North Star directly on my right shoulder and pushed forward. Just as the first sliver of dawn broke, when my resolve was starting to fray, I saw it, the silhouette of structures. Old, crumbling, but man-made. It turned out to be a small, long-abandoned Berber village. Most of the mud brick homes had dissolved back into the earth, but miracle of miracles, there was an old well in the center. The water was brackish and tasted heavily of minerals, but it was water. I drank slowly, carefully, then found the most sheltered, intact building and collapsed into sleep. When I woke, the sun was high and someone was watching me. He was an elderly man, sitting cross-legged near the doorway. His face was weathered like old leather, and his eyes were kind but deeply curious. He spoke in a blend of Arabic and Berber, gesturing toward me with concern. "American," I croaked, pointing to myself. "Lost. Family left me." I used a simple, illustrative gesture. His expression darkened. He understood enough. Abandoning an elder in the wilderness was appalling to him, an unforgivable offense against honor. Over the next day, this kind stranger, whose name sounded like Karim, taught me rudimentary desert survival, how to collect dew using a cloth, how to identify the rare edible scrub, and how to read the faint desert winds for direction. He gave me confirmation of something I hadn't known. At 75, stripped of all my comforts, I was tougher than I had ever allowed myself to believe. On the second morning, Karim offered to guide me toward the distant main road. But before we left the abandoned village, I made a crucial stop. Using a piece of burnt wood from an ancient fire pit, I scrawled a message on the most visible wall. "Charlotte Vance and Wesley Hayes left me here to die on November 20th, 2025. They murdered me for Arthur's money. Eleanor Vance." Then I repeated the message, carving it into a flat, sun-baked stone near the well. Call it insurance. Call it a suicide note turned evidence. I called it the first meticulous step in what was going to be the most satisfying, long-drawn-out revenge of my life. The truck that finally stopped for Karim and me was driven by a French-Moroccan archaeologist, Dr. Youssef Al-Jaziri, who took one look at my condition, sunburned, dehydrated, and looking like a corpse had risen from the sand, and immediately radioed for help. As we drove toward a small clinic outside Risani, I found myself in the interesting position of trying to convince everyone not to help me too much. Dr. Al-Jaziri wanted to call the police. The embassy attaché, a young man named David, wanted to launch an immediate international incident. "I appreciate the concern," I told David Patterson, the embassy official, once I was stable in a hotel in Casablanca. "But I need to handle this my own way. My family abandoned me, yes. That is attempted murder, and they will pay, but not the way you think." What I didn't tell David was that I had already made 3 highly critical phone calls from the clinic. The first was to Mr. Sterling, Arthur's attorney in Minneapolis, who nearly collapsed when he heard my voice. "Eleanor, thank God. Charlotte and Wesley reported you missing 2 days ago. They said you wandered off during a market trip and never returned. The local police have been searching." "Mr. Sterling," I cut in, my voice tight with authority. "Listen carefully. Charlotte and Wesley attempted to kill me. They left me in the desert. You are not, under any circumstances, to give them access to any of Arthur's accounts or assets. If they ask, the estate is frozen pending my return." He paused, a professional financial mind grappling with human depravity. "My God, Eleanor, are you certain?" I spent 2 days in the Sahara with a bottle of water and a bag of crackers. "I am very certain. Now I need you to activate the contingency plan Arthur and I discussed years ago." The contingency plan was Arthur's final stroke of genius. Buried deep in our estate documents was an irrevocable provision. If I ever died under suspicious or violent circumstances, or if any named heir is proven to be involved in fraud or attempted harm against Eleanor Vance, an automatic investigation would be triggered, and all assets would be frozen until a criminal resolution was achieved. Charlotte and Wesley had no idea this safeguard existed. My second call went to the president of my private bank in Minneapolis. This is Eleanor Vance. I need a maximum level fraud alert placed on every single one of my personal and trust accounts immediately. Mrs. Vance, what is the nature of the fraudulent activity? The nature, I replied, is that my own daughter and her criminal husband will attempt to access or liquidate assets after leaving me for dead in North Africa. Flag everything. My third call was the most satisfying. I dialed Charlotte's cell number. She answered on the first ring. Hello? Her voice was thin, tense, and terrified. Hello, sweetheart. The silence that followed was a physical presence. Mom, she finally whispered. But how? Where are you? I'm in Casablanca, Charlotte. Alive, in case you were wondering. Though I suppose that's not what you were hoping to hear. Mom, I don't understand. Wesley and I have been frantic. We reported you missing from the hotel. We've been looking everywhere. Cut the act, I said, my voice harder than I'd ever heard it. I know exactly what you and Wesley did. The question is, what happens next? I could hear Wesley shouting frantic questions in the background. Charlotte's voice was shaking when she spoke again. Mom, please, I think there's been a terrible misunderstanding, a terrible mistake. The only mistake was mine, Charlotte, thinking you had any love or loyalty left for your family. But that is about to be corrected. You and Wesley just made the biggest blunder of your lives. You thought you were eliminating a helpless old woman. Instead, you've awakened someone who has nothing left to lose and unlimited resources for revenge. I hung up, leaving her with the sound of her own panicked breathing. What they did was attempted murder, but a legal prosecution would be quick and impersonal. What I had in mind was going to be an agonizing, slow-motion destruction. Over the next 2 days, while resting in a luxurious hotel, I put the rest of my plan into motion. First, I hired a highly discreet international private investigation firm. What they quickly uncovered was horrifyingly predictable. Wesley Hayes was not just a gold digger. He was a meticulous, professional con artist with a history of targeting wealthy, grieving women. Charlotte was just his latest mark. Second, the PI confirmed Wesley was facing colossal debt, not gambling, but failure to deliver on a $5 million real estate scheme to powerful, patient, and exceptionally ruthless investors in Dubai. His plan wasn't about greed. It was about paying off people who considered kneecaps a negotiable commodity. By the time Charlotte and Wesley figured out that their $450 million prize was locked down tighter than a vault, it would be far too late. The game was just beginning, and for the first time since Arthur's passing, I felt truly alive. A week later, I was back in Minneapolis, but I didn't go home. I stayed in a corporate apartment while my PI firm, Harrison and Associates, worked. I watched Wesley and Charlotte stumble out of a brief meeting at the American consulate. They had flown back, panicking after I cut off their access to the joint credit card. They looked haggard, stressed, and thoroughly defeated. I had spent the day at the local police department, but again, I didn't press charges. I gave them a carefully edited version of events. A massive misunderstanding, officer. They thought I was with a local guide when they left the car. They were panicked when they couldn't find me. I wanted them to unravel slowly, publicly, and completely. Criminal charges were too clean. I followed them to their apartment, the one I paid for, and knocked. Wesley answered, and the color drained from his face when he saw me, like someone had pulled a plug. Eleanor, May I come in, Wesley? We need to talk. Charlotte appeared behind him, her eyes raw from crying. Mom, I'm so sorry, Wesley said. He said it was the only way that someone would find you quickly. You just decided to trust your husband over your mother, I said, settling into a velvet armchair. How exactly did that work out for you? Wesley, the cagey animal, began to pace. Look, Eleanor, I know this looks bad, but you can't prove intent. Sit down, Wesley. The command was soft, but it made him obey instantly. I've had a few interesting conversations over the past few days, I continued. With Mr. Sterling, my bank, Harrison and Associates, and yes, with a couple of very unpleasant people in Dubai who seem to have lost a $5 million investment and are now extremely interested in finding you. Wesley went completely still. Did you really think I wouldn't find out? About your failed real estate venture? About the fact that you're a professional con artist with a history of targeting elderly women? My 27-year-old daughter was just a temporary vehicle to get to my money. Charlotte stared at him, her face a mask of dawning horror. Wesley, what debt? What is she talking about? Oh, he didn't tell you, I asked, feigning innocent surprise. Wesley not only owes a crippling sum to a consortium in the Middle East, people who are now looking for him with surgical precision, but he's also already married. Charlotte's eyes widened. What? Let's see. There was Mrs. Davies in Seattle, divorced and $700,000 lighter. Mrs. Chen in Florida, $400,000. And my personal favorite, Mrs. Blackwood in Atlanta, to whom he is currently legally married. Which means, sweetheart, that your marriage to Wesley isn't legal. Bigamy is a serious offense. Charlotte sank onto the couch, staring at the man she had tried to murder her mother for. That's not— You're lying. Am I? I reached into my purse and pulled out a photo. It was a close-up of the message I'd carved into the stone in the desert. Charlotte Vance and Wesley Hayes left me here to die. This little note is now in the hands of the Moroccan police, the U.S. consulate, and Mr. Sterling. It's evidence of premeditated murder, and I provided GPS coordinates to verify the exact spot where you abandoned me. Wesley finally found his voice, a frantic, desperate whisper. What do you want, Eleanor? We'll give you anything. We'll leave the country. I want to watch you both face the full, unexpurgated consequences of your actions, I said, standing up. I want Charlotte to finally understand the cost of her spectacular lack of loyalty. And I want you, Wesley, to feel what it's like when someone smarter and wealthier than you decides to dismantle your pathetic life. I laid out the ultimatum. Tomorrow morning, you are both going to my attorney's office. You will sign comprehensive confessions detailing the fraud, the abandonment, and your intent to steal the estate. If you refuse, I make one phone call. The investors in Dubai get your exact location. The IRS gets a very detailed report on your fraudulent joint tax filings. The police get the bigamy charge. You have until morning. As I walked out, I could hear Charlotte screaming at Wesley, demanding to know what other lies he'd told her. The sound was not pleasant, but it was, undeniably, music to my ears. The next morning, I treated myself to a luxurious brunch at a downtown spot overlooking the Mississippi River. Charlotte had called 4 times. Wesley had called once, which I answered only to hang up immediately. By noon, the PI texted me that they were at Mr. Sterling's office. The confessions were signed. 3 weeks later, I drove to Charlotte's apartment one last time. Wesley was gone, held without bail on fraud and bigamy charges. Charlotte answered the door, a shell of the confident young woman she used to be. Mom, Eleanor, I've been cooperating. I told the police everything about Wesley's plans. Please, can we talk about us? We are talking about us, Charlotte, I said, stepping past her. But I have something for you. I handed her the documents. The first was a formal disinheritance notice. You will receive nothing when I die. Not a penny of Arthur's money. After what you did, you no longer have a claim to this family's legacy. She crumpled the paper. You can't. I'm your only child. I'm sorry. I swear I'm sorry. You stopped being my child when you left me to die in a place where I couldn't even call for help. Your apology is only for your failure to commit a crime cleanly. I pulled out the second, more important document, a declaration from the court allowing me to proceed with a massive civil suit against her for elder abuse, fraud, and attempted wrongful death. Wesley is facing years in federal prison, but that is his consequence. This is yours. The civil suit will ensure that every single asset you possess, your car, your jewelry, any future income you might earn, will be seized until you pay me what the court deems appropriate. She collapsed onto the carpet, tears streaming down her face. But Mom, I'm going to prison anyway. You said 3 years. Why this too? Because, Charlotte, I want you to spend every single day of those 3 years knowing that your mother is still alive, still wealthy, and still watching. I want you to understand what you forfeited for a lie. 6 months later, I sat in the packed courtroom and watched Wesley Hayes accept a plea deal for 9 years in federal prison for a host of crimes, including elder fraud, bigamy, and conspiracy to commit murder. Charlotte sat next to him, tearfully accepting her own 3-year sentence for conspiracy and attempted murder. When the judge asked if they had anything to say, Wesley stood up, a shadow of the charming predator he once was. He looked broken. He offered a mumbled, rote apology. Then the judge turned to me. "Mrs. Vance, would you like to make a statement?" I stood up slowly, feeling the weight of my 75 years, but also the lightness of my victory. "Your Honor," I began, my voice clear and steady, carrying easily across the silent room. "6 months ago, these two people left me to perish in the Moroccan desert because they wanted my husband's fortune. They thought they were dealing with a helpless old woman who would be easy to eliminate." I paused, letting the silence build. They were wrong on every count. I wasn't helpless. I wasn't easy to eliminate. And most importantly, the $450 million they were so desperate to steal was never going to be theirs in the first place. I nodded to Mr. Sterling, who handed a sealed document to the court clerk. "This is Arthur's original will. Drafted 5 years ago, Your Honor. In it, he specifically and irrevocably disinherits Charlotte Vance if she ever attempts to harm me or steal from our estate." Arthur was a brilliant man. He understood exactly what her greed might lead to. Charlotte's face, which had been pale, went completely white. "She looked like she might faint. He never told us," she gasped. "Because Arthur hoped he would never have to use that provision," I said, looking directly at her. "He understood human nature better than I did, but I have learned." The judge reviewed the document, his brow furrowed. "Mrs. Vance, this is a valid and airtight legal provision." "It is, Your Honor, which means that even if their plan had succeeded, even if they had managed to kill me, Charlotte would have inherited precisely nothing. The entire estate was designed to go to international medical charities if anything suspicious happened to me." The silence in the courtroom was absolute. "You see, Your Honor," I concluded, turning to the judge, "they didn't just try to commit murder. They tried to commit a completely pointless murder. They traded their future, their freedom, and their very souls for money they were never, ever going to get." I turned to Charlotte directly, my expression cold. "You traded your mother's life for an inheritance that was an illusion. You chose a criminal over your own family, and now you will spend the next 3 years in a cage, thinking about the utter futility of that choice." She was sobbing, but I felt nothing. The mother who had raised her was gone. She died in that desert, along with any lingering maternal feelings I had left. As they led Charlotte and Wesley away in handcuffs, Wesley looked back, and I saw something strange in his eyes. Not hatred, but a reluctant, bitter respect. "You planned this whole thing," he said, the old charm gone, replaced by grudging awe. "From the moment we left you, you knew exactly what you were going to do to us. I told you that first night in Casablanca that you'd awakened something dangerous," I replied, a small, triumphant smile touching my lips. "You chose not to listen. That evening, I treated myself. I was back in the dining room overlooking the Mississippi, ordering the most expensive bottle of Bordeaux and the best seafood the city could offer. Tomorrow, I would start the next chapter of my life. I was thinking of travel, maybe a proper trip to Morocco, one where I could thank Karim properly and sit by the Atlas Mountains in peace. Perhaps I would purchase a historic villa in Tuscany or a small fishing boat on the coast of Maine. The money was still mine, all $450 million of it. But more importantly, I had learned a truth I never knew. I was stronger than I had ever imagined, smarter than anyone had given me credit for, and absolutely ruthless when someone threatened what was mine. Arthur would have been proud. I raised my glass in a silent toast to the man who prepared the ultimate test. I had not only survived, I had triumphed completely. The desert tried to kill me. My own family tried to betray me, and I emerged from the dust stronger than ever. At 75 years old, I had learned it's never too late to discover what you're truly capable of. And what I was capable of, apparently, was magnificent, meticulous revenge.